Now, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't say then why they turned him over to Pilate. But we can only surmise that the reason they did is because they didn't want his blood on their hands. They didn't want a riot among the people. And so in order to get Pilate, the prefect, the Roman prefect, involved and to get his blood off their hands, they had to change the charge of blasphemy to a charge that he was being anti-Roman. He was trying to stir up anti-Roman sentiments. And these are the charges that they ushered against him. I'm just going to have you do it, Leanna. By beginning with the perverting of our nation, the Sanhedrin implies that the nation is and would remain loyal to Rome unless Jesus persuaded them otherwise. This was their first charge. He was perverting the nation. I'm just going to let you advance it. They accused Jesus of forbidding to pay the taxes to the emperor. Remember when they brought the coin before him and say, should we pay Caesar? Whose face is on it? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. They twisted that for their own purposes. And then thirdly, they said he claims to be a Messiah, the king. We have no king but Caesar. And so by suggesting this, they would say that he would go against the ruler of that day. He was a threat. He needed to be done away with. A secret trial by night, a festival day, charges changed, no charges really agreeing with each other. You get the point. Condemned by the righteous, he was guilty before he had a chance. Interestingly enough, this whole thing about the Sanhedrin, there were two that sat on that Sanhedrin that day that made appearances later in Scripture. One was Joseph of Arimathea. You remember what he did? He went to recover the body, to prepare it, to bring it to his own burial site, that it may be buried properly. And if you read in John's Gospel, John chapter 3, a figure shows up in the night. Sir, what must I do to be saved? Nicodemus, one of the members of the Sanhedrin, who appears again in John 18 with 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe, spices to help bury Jesus. Now, if these two men were on the Sanhedrin, both Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, where were they? Why didn't they speak out that day against what was being done to Jesus? Fear is a strange thing. When our power base and our popularity is challenged by someone, we will twist truth to protect ourselves. We will stuff our feelings deep inside, and we'll grow silent, and we'll go right along with the crowd because we can't manage what some would do if we spoke out. The words of the 18th century Edmund Burke, the British philosopher, are worth hearing again. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. That's exactly what happened. Some would suggest that the Salem witch trials, the Holocaust, the 1953 Joseph McCarthy Red Scare, the apartheid laws in South Africa, all of those were because good people maybe did nothing. Many other points that could be made. I'll leave us with this thought about Peter and his denial. We know Peter's track record, so we're not surprised at all at anything that Peter does or says anymore. He's like an obnoxious little brother or sister or a friend who speaks out inappropriately at the most unforgiving times. Peter would say the first thing that came to his mind. And so, remember at the supper, oh, even these will deny you, but I'll never deny you. They can just hear him sitting at the table. They recognize his voice and that thick Galilean accent. I'll never betray you. In Matthew and Mark's gospel, when he hears the cock crow, he remembers what Jesus has said. And he goes off and he weeps bitterly for what he's done. Luke, however, puts it this way. We know that even though all the other disciples fled, we undersell Peter. He did at least creep out of the shadows and make it into the temple courtyard, where he alone, though John would say he was there too, where he alone watched from a distance the trial. But Luke says when the cock crowed that Jesus looked at Peter straightway in the eye. It's one thing to be caught after you've done the sin. It's another thing to be caught in the very midst of it. In the midst of a lie, to be caught in the midst of doing something that you'd rather not be known in public, to be caught in the midst of saying more than you should say, something that you can't take back, or not talking at all when you should have talked. And it's something to be confronted by the very glance of the Messiah, like Peter. Peter was the sole disciple that chose to be present at the courtyard that night. And interestingly enough, did you notice that in none of the Gospels, none of the people who betrayed him or who deserted him or who ran away from him, none of them did he scold or berate. Rather, he appeared to them. He made his presence known to them. It was never mentioned. We see that Peter gained even a place of favor after his denial. Mark says upon his resurrection that the women appeared at the tomb and they were told to go tell the disciples, and Peter is set aside. Go tell them to wait for me in Galilee. Matthew says that Peter is given the keys to the kingdom, and upon Peter will a church be built. After all, he was the only one who was willing to get out of the boat and walk on the water, remember. Acts tells us that Peter delivered the first sermon after Pentecost. And John says that in chapter 21, after the charcoal fire and the 153 fish have been brought up to the shore, that Jesus takes Peter aside and asks him, not once, but twice, but 3 times, Peter, do you love me more than these? If you do, feed my sheep. 1, 2, 3 times, enough to remind him. And with the 153 catch, that even in his denial and betrayal, his grace is sufficient, not once, but twice, and over again. These thoughts, I think, are worth remembering. I'm going to ask for Leanna's help. These questions. In what ways would you say that Jesus is still a threat to people's ways of life today? Next. To what extent do you think people's resistance to Jesus and his message is motivated by some type of fear? When have you and I denied or failed to speak up for Christ? When do we do it? Why do we do it? How can we change that? And then think about the power of Christ's forgiveness and grace. Where is the place where you most need it? What will you do to find it? We'll put these on the website so you can think about these this week. Now, we're at the hour and we've been working really hard, and when you have this much time to preach in a video, it limits us, and I'm sorry. Let's do this. We're going to invite our praise team to come back. If you can stay and receive what they have to offer us, do that. If you feel like you need to head on to Sunday school, you can do that as well. Bless you for your presence, and stay in your pew or come up to the altar if you like, and do what you need to with this closing time.